The first thing Marcus heard was the sound of glass shattering. Not the gentle tinkle of a dropped cup, but the violent explosion of his bedroom window as something heavy crashed through it. His body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. 23 years of military training kicked in, and he was rolling off his bed, hitting the floor hard, his prosthetic leg sending a jolt of pain up his spine. Get down, hands where we can see them." The voices were everywhere, echoing off the thin walls of Riverside Gardens public housing complex. Marcus pressed himself against the cold linoleum floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The red and blue lights painting his walls told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't gang violence. This was law enforcement. And somehow, they were here for him. 3 hours earlier, Marcus Rodriguez had been sitting in his small kitchen, working on a crossword puzzle and sipping his evening coffee. The routine helped calm the storm that perpetually raged in his mind. 7 years since the IED took his leg and shattered his nerves. But the nightmares still came. The flashbacks still struck without warning. The therapy helped, but some wounds never fully healed. His apartment in Building C was modest but clean. The walls were decorated with commendations from his service in Afghanistan, a folded American flag from his discharge ceremony, and photos of his unit. On the kitchen counter sat his medication organizer, filled with the pills that kept him functional. Anxiety medication, pain relievers, sleep aids, all prescribed, all legal, all necessary for him to face each day. The Riverside Gardens complex housed mostly elderly residents, disabled veterans like himself, and single mothers struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. The rent was affordable. The management was understanding about his disability checks, and most of the neighbors kept to themselves. Most of them. Karen Mitchell had moved into Building C 6 months ago, and, from the first day, she'd made it clear she didn't belong there. She drove a newer SUV while most residents took the bus. She wore designer clothes to the mailbox while others counted pennies for groceries. Most tellingly, she complained about everything. The noise from children playing, the smell of ethnic cooking drifting through the halls, the way Marcus parked his beat-up Honda Civic. "That spot is too close to my car," she'd said just that morning, marching up to him as he climbed out of his vehicle. "I don't want your piece of junk denting my BMW." Marcus had looked at the parking spaces. His car was squarely within the painted lines, nowhere near her vehicle. "Ma'am, I'm parked legally." "There's plenty of clearance between our cars." Karen's face had flushed red, her perfectly styled blonde hair trembling with indignation. "Don't you dare tell me what's legal. I know my rights. People like you think you can just take whatever you want, but I won't stand for it." Marcus had simply nodded and walked away. He'd dealt with worse things than an angry neighbor. But as he'd climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, he'd heard her muttering behind him. Something about troublemakers and not feeling safe. He should have paid more attention to those words. Now, as tactical boots thundered up the stairway toward his door, Marcus understood that Karen Mitchell had escalated far beyond parking complaints. The sound of his neighbors screaming in terror filled the night air. Mrs. Chen from 2A was crying in Mandarin. The Johnson kids from 1B were wailing as their mother tried to comfort them. Old Mr. Peterson's oxygen tank was hissing somewhere nearby, probably knocked over in the chaos. "Search warrant! Open up!" Marcus struggled to his feet, his prosthetic catching on the scattered glass from his window. I'm coming! The door's unlocked." He didn't want them breaking down his door. He couldn't afford to replace it, and the housing authority would charge him for damages. His hands shook as he turned the deadbolt, muscle memory from combat zones making him want to take cover, to fight, to run. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This was home. These were police officers doing their job. The door exploded inward anyway. 6 officers in tactical gear flooded into his tiny apartment, weapons drawn, shouting commands that blended into an incomprehensible wall of sound. Marcus raised his hands, his prosthetic leg making him wobble unsteadily. "Where are the weapons?" The lead officer's voice cut through the chaos. "We know you've got them stashed somewhere." "What weapons?" Marcus's voice cracked. The room was spinning, closing in on him. "I don't have any weapons. This is a mistake." But they were already moving, tearing through his belongings with systematic efficiency. His medication organizer crashed to the floor, pills scattering across the linoleum. They ripped apart his couch cushions, dumped out his dresser drawers, swept everything off his kitchen counter. His military awards were knocked from the walls, the glass frames shattering. "Check the closets. Check under the bed. Anonymous tip says he's got enough firepower to start a war." Anonymous tip. Marcus's blood ran cold as the pieces clicked together. Karen Mitchell's face flashed in his mind, her venomous words from that morning echoing in his ears. The way she'd looked at his military photos when she'd first seen him move in. The comments about feeling unsafe. The search lasted 2 hours. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Marcus owned no weapons, stored no ammunition, harbored no arsenal. The most dangerous thing in his apartment was a kitchen knife that he used to make sandwiches. But by the time they realized their mistake, the damage was done. Not just to his apartment, which looked like a tornado had torn through it. Not just to his possessions, most of which were broken or destroyed. The real damage was to the fragile peace he'd built in his mind, the careful routine that kept the demons at bay. As the officers filed out with mumbled apologies, Marcus collapsed on his ruined couch and felt the familiar darkness creeping in. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The walls felt like they were closing in, and suddenly, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was back in the Humvee, the IED exploding beneath them, his buddies screaming, the smell of blood and smoke and burning metal filling his nostrils. "No, no, no," he whispered, rocking back and forth. "Not here. Not now. Please." But the panic attack came anyway, as they always did when his carefully constructed world was shattered. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers, managing to dial his therapist's emergency line before the world went black. The aftermath rippled through Riverside Gardens, like a stone thrown into still water. Mrs. Chen hadn't slept since the raid, jumping at every sound, afraid that more officers would come crashing through her door. Her grandson visited the next day and found her sitting in her kitchen with all the lights on, too terrified to close her eyes. The Johnson family's youngest son, 8-year-old Malik, had wet his bed every night since witnessing the tactical team storm through the hallways. His mother, Sarah, had to take time off work to stay home with him, time she couldn't afford to lose. Mr. Peterson's oxygen tank had indeed been knocked over during the chaos. The sudden loss of oxygen had triggered a medical emergency, and he'd spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctor said his heart couldn't take much more stress at his age, but the person most affected, besides Marcus himself, was 7-year-old Luna Delgado from apartment 1C. Luna had been playing in the courtyard when the tactical vehicles arrived, their sirens wailing and lights blazing. The little girl had a condition that made her sensitive to loud noises and sudden changes. And the trauma of that night had sent her into a catatonic state. She hadn't spoken since the raid, just sat by her window, staring out at the parking lot where Marcus's car still sat with a ticket under the windshield wiper. The management company, Riverside Properties, issued a brief statement expressing regret for the inconvenience and promised to work with residents to address any concerns. But statements didn't repair broken windows or mend traumatized minds. The complex felt different now. charged with an undercurrent of fear and mistrust. Marcus spent a week in the psychiatric ward at the VA hospital. When he returned home, his apartment had been cleaned and his window replaced, courtesy of a few neighbors who'd pooled their money together. Mrs. Chen had organized the effort, despite her own trauma from that night. "We look out for each other here," she told him in her accented English when he thanked her. "That's what makes us family." But even family couldn't erase what had happened. Marcus found himself checking his locks obsessively, jumping at every sound in the hallway. His therapy sessions increased from once a week to 3 times. And his doctor adjusted his medications again, adding new pills to combat the renewed anxiety and depression. Karen Mitchell, meanwhile, seemed to have vanished. Her BMW hadn't moved from its spot since the night of the raid, and no one had seen her coming or going from her apartment. Some residents speculated that she'd gone to stay with family while the heat died down. Others wondered if she'd been arrested herself for filing a false report. The truth was more complicated than either scenario. Detective Ray Morrison had worked false report cases before, but this one bothered him more than most. The level of resources deployed based on one anonymous call, the trauma inflicted on innocent residents, the complete absence of any evidence to support the claims. It all pointed to a deliberate attempt to weaponize law enforcement against a specific target. The call had come in at 8:47 p.m. on Tuesday night. A woman's voice, shaky and urgent, claiming that her neighbor in Building C of Riverside Gardens was stockpiling weapons and making threats against other residents. "He's got military training," the caller had said. "I've seen him carrying in duffel bags at night. He talks about the war all the time, how he misses the action. I think he's planning something terrible." The call had triggered standard protocols for potential domestic terrorism. A tactical response team was assembled, search warrants were obtained, and a major operation was launched, all based on the word of one anonymous caller who claimed a fear for her safety. But Morrison's investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies in the caller's story. The phone number traced back to a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash, but security cameras at the store where it was bought showed a woman matching Karen Mitchell's description making the purchase. More damning still was what Morrison discovered about Karen herself. Karen Louise Mitchell had a history. Not a criminal history exactly, but a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture. In her previous neighborhood in Westchester County, she'd filed complaints against 17 different neighbors over the course of 2 years. Noise complaints, property line disputes, allegations of drug dealing, reports of suspicious activity. The local police had eventually flagged her number as a frequent false reporter. Before that, in a suburb of Hartford, she'd been involved in a homeowners association dispute that had escalated to the point where a restraining order was filed against her. She'd accused her neighbors of everything from mail theft to animal abuse, none of which were substantiated by evidence. The pattern was clear to Morrison. Karen Mitchell was a person who used authority figures as weapons against people she didn't like. The fact that she'd targeted a disabled veteran with PTSD made it particularly reprehensible. But proving it would require more than circumstantial evidence and behavioral patterns. Morrison needed concrete proof that Karen had made the false report, and that meant finding the smoking gun that connected her directly to the call. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Washington was 16 years old and, like most teenagers, was constantly recording things on his phone, TikTok videos, Snapchat stories, random moments throughout his day. He lived in apartment 2D, right next to Karen Mitchell's unit, and on Tuesday evening, he'd been filming a video for his girlfriend when he'd captured something significant. Tommy's mother, Denise, had heard about the investigation through the neighborhood gossip network that operated with the efficiency of a military intelligence operation. When she asked her son if he'd noticed anything unusual that night, Tommy remembered his phone video. "Mom, you gotta see this," he said, pulling up the footage on his phone. The video was shaky and poorly lit, Typical teenage phone cinematography. But the audio was clear. In the background, while Tommy was talking to his camera about his day, Karen Mitchell's voice could be heard through the thin walls. She was on the phone, and her words were unmistakable. "He's definitely dangerous. Military training. You know I've seen him carrying bags into his apartment at night. Heavy bags. And he talks about combat all the time. How he misses the action." The video had a timestamp 8:44 p.m. The emergency call to police was logged at 8:47 p.m. Denise Washington called Detective Morrison immediately. When Morrison knocked on Karen's door 3 days later, she answered with the confidence of someone who believed she'd gotten away with something. She was wearing a silk blouse and perfectly applied makeup, as if she'd been expecting company. "Detective Morrison, Police Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident that occurred here earlier this week." Karen's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that terrible night. I was so frightened. I'm just grateful the police responded so quickly to whoever called in that tip." "About that tip, ma'am. We have reason to believe it came from someone in this building. Someone who knew details about Mr. Rodriguez that wouldn't be obvious to a casual observer." The blood drained from Karen's face, but she maintained her composure. "Well, I suppose any of his neighbors might have noticed suspicious behavior. These walls are very thin. You know." "Yes, ma'am. They are. In fact, they're so thin that sounds carry quite easily from one apartment to another. Conversations, phone calls, that sort of thing." Morrison pulled out his phone and played Tommy's video. Karen's own voice filled the hallway, damning and clear. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled as she realized she'd been caught. "I want to speak to my lawyer," she said quietly. "That's your right, ma'am. Karen Mitchell, you're under arrest for filing a false police report, reckless endangerment, and harassment. You have the right to remain silent." The arrest sent shockwaves through Riverside Gardens, but not the kind Karen had probably intended. Instead of vindication, residents felt a mixture of relief and outrage. Relief that the truth had come out. Outrage that one person's malice had caused so much pain to their community. Mrs. Chen organized a support meeting in the community room the following Saturday. Nearly every resident attended, creating a packed room of people who'd been strangers to each other just a week before, but now shared a common experience of trauma and recovery. Marcus attended reluctantly. He wasn't much for group settings anymore, especially after the raid had triggered such severe anxiety. But his therapist had encouraged him to go, to see that he wasn't alone in his suffering. "What Karen did to us was wrong." Mrs. Chen addressed the room in her careful English. "But what we do now, that's up to us. We can let her poison continue to hurt us, or we can heal together." Sarah Johnson spoke about her son Malik's nightmares, how he'd started drawing pictures of police cars and asking if the bad lady was going to send them back. Luna Delgado's mother wept as she described her daughter's continued silence. The way the little girl flinched at every siren that passed on the street outside. Mr. Peterson, still weak from his hospital stay, talked about the importance of community trust. "I've lived in public housing for 12 years, he said, his voice shaky but determined. "This is the first time I've ever felt unsafe in my own home. Not because of crime or violence, but because someone decided to use the police as a weapon against her neighbor." When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he almost declined. But looking around the room at faces he recognized, people he'd nodded to in the hallways, but never really talked to, he felt something shift in his chest. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were survivors of the same attack, victims of the same cruelty. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I'd left the war behind when I came home. But what Karen did, it brought the war right into our living rooms. She turned our safe space into a battlefield." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But sitting here with all of you, I realized something. We survived. All of us. And we're going to keep surviving. Together." The applause was tentative at first, then growing stronger, as residents realized they'd found something valuable in their shared trauma community. Karen Mitchell's trial began 6 months later, but by then, the residents of Riverside Gardens had transformed their pain into purpose. The community that had barely known each other's names before the raid had become a tight-knit family that looked out for one another. Tommy Washington had started a neighborhood watch program, not to spy on residents, but to ensure everyone's safety and well-being. Mrs. Chen organized weekly potluck dinners where families shared food and stories from their cultures. Luna Delgado, with help from therapy and the supportive community around her, had begun speaking again, though she still jumped at loud noises. Marcus had become an unofficial counselor for other veterans in the complex. His own trauma from that night had been profound, but working through it in therapy had given him tools to help others facing similar struggles. The VA had even asked him to consider training as a peer support specialist. The prosecution's case against Karen was overwhelming. The phone records, Tommy's video, her history of false reports, and the testimony of numerous residents painted a clear picture of malicious intent. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she genuinely believed Marcus was dangerous, but the evidence showed premeditation and calculation. During the trial, disturbing details emerged about Karen's motivations. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed her true feelings about the residents of Riverside Gardens. She'd complained to friends about living among those people, making thinly veiled racist comments about the diverse community. Messages specifically about Marcus included phrases like "creepy veteran" and "probably unstable." Most damning of all was a message sent to her sister the day before the raid. "I've figured out how to get rid of the problem neighbor. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire." The verdict came on a gray Tuesday morning in November. Guilty on all counts. Karen Mitchell sat rigidly in her chair as the judge read the decision, her designer suit and perfect hair contrasting sharply with the orange jumpsuit in her immediate future. Judge Patricia Hendricks had reviewed the case thoroughly, including victim impact statements from every resident affected by Karen's actions. Her words during sentencing were measured but pointed. "Ms. Mitchell, your actions represent a particularly insidious form of harassment. You weaponized law enforcement against an innocent man, causing trauma not just to your target, but to an entire community of vulnerable residents. You turned public safety resources into instruments of personal vengeance." The sentence was comprehensive: 18 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, complete restitution for all property damage caused during the raid, payment for trauma therapy for affected residents, and a permanent restraining order, preventing her from contacting anyone from Riverside Gardens. Additionally, Riverside Properties had already terminated her lease and barred her from all their properties. The fair housing violation lawsuit filed by the residents' pro bono legal team was still pending, but early settlements suggested Karen would be paying for her crimes for years to come. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the fragile, medicated peace he'd been clinging to since his discharge, but genuine tranquility that came from seeing justice served and community restored. The residents who'd attended the trial gathered outside the courthouse, not in celebration, but in quiet solidarity. They'd been through hell together, but they'd emerged stronger. The complex that had once been just a place to live had become a true home, defended and defined by the people who lived there. Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes as she hugged Marcus goodbye. "Thank you," she said simply, for being brave enough to stand up, for showing us we could stand up too. Luna Delgado ran up to Marcus and handed him a drawing she'd made. It showed the Riverside Gardens complex, but instead of the stark, utilitarian buildings he'd always seen, Luna had drawn it surrounded by flowers and sunshine, with stick figures of all the residents holding hands in a circle around it. "It's our home," she said, her voice small but clear, "and nobody can take it away from us anymore." 6 months after the trial, Riverside Gardens was featured in a local newspaper article about community resilience. The reporter interviewed residents about how they'd transformed their trauma into strength, creating support systems that extended far beyond their housing complex. Marcus had indeed become a certified peer support specialist and was working with other veterans dealing with PTSD and adjustment disorders. His experience with Karen's false report had become a teaching tool for understanding how civilian harassment could trigger military trauma, and his recovery had inspired other veterans to seek help. The community garden that residents had planted in the courtyard was thriving. Each family had claimed a plot, growing everything from tomatoes to herbs to flowers. It had become a gathering place where children played while their parents worked side by side, sharing stories and building friendships that transcended cultural and economic differences. Tommy Washington had received a Community Service Award for his role in exposing Karen's crime. He'd used the experience to launch a social media campaign about the dangers of filing false police reports, particularly against vulnerable populations. His videos had gone viral, sparking conversations about accountability and the weaponization of law enforcement. But perhaps the most significant change was the one you couldn't see in newspaper articles or social media posts. It was the way Mrs. Chen no longer jumped at unexpected sounds, the way Malik Johnson had stopped having nightmares about police raids, the way Luna Delgado laughed when she played in the courtyard, her fear replaced by the security of knowing her community would protect her. On a warm evening in late spring, exactly 1 year after the raid that had shattered their peace, the residents of Riverside Gardens held their first annual Community Appreciation Dinner. Tables were set up in the courtyard. Potluck dishes representing dozens of cultures filled every surface, and children ran between the adults while their parents shared stories and laughter. Marcus sat at a table with his chosen family, Mrs. Chen, the Johnson family, the Washingtons, the Delgados, Mr. Peterson, and dozens of others who'd become more than neighbors. They were survivors, fighters, people who'd refused to let one person's hatred destroy their home. As the sun set behind the buildings of Riverside Gardens, casting long shadows across the courtyard where children played and adults talked, Marcus felt something he'd been searching for since the day he'd come home from Afghanistan, belonging, not just to a place, but to a community that had chosen to stand together against those who would divide them. The scars from that night would always remain. In Marcus's renewed anxiety disorder, in Luna's sensitivity to sudden noises, in the way everyone still felt a moment of panic when they heard sirens approaching. But scars were proof of survival, evidence that they'd endured something terrible and come through it stronger. Karen Mitchell's attempt to destroy their community had backfired spectacularly. Instead of driving them apart, her malice had brought them together. Instead of making them weaker, her attack had made them unbreakable. She'd wanted to remove one man she didn't like from her neighborhood, but in the end, she was the one who'd been removed, expelled not just from Riverside Gardens, but from any position where she could harm vulnerable people again. As Marcus looked around at the faces of his neighbors, his family, his community, he realized that Karen had given them something valuable without meaning to. She'd shown them what they were capable of when they stood together. She'd proven that their home was worth fighting for, that their community was worth protecting, and that no amount of hatred could destroy what they'd built together. The night of terror had ended. The age of community had begun. and in Apartment 2C of Building C at Riverside Gardens Public Housing Complex. A disabled veteran slept peacefully, knowing he was exactly where he belonged. Justice had been served. Peace had been restored. And home was exactly what they'd made it, a place where people looked out for each other, stood up for what was right, and refused to let fear win. The story of Riverside Gardens would be told for years to come, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of false accusations, but as an inspiring example of how communities can heal, grow, and thrive when they choose to face adversity together rather than alone. In the end, Karen Mitchell had accomplished the opposite of what she'd intended. She'd made them all stronger, brought them all together, and shown them all what home really meant. And, for that unintended gift, wrapped though it was in trauma and pain, the residents of Riverside Gardens were ultimately grateful. Their community had been forged in the fire of that terrible night, and like all things made strong by flame, it would endure long after the source of heat had been removed and forgotten.